interest is rather a narrow one for this story, and we still aren't actually sure if there is a story, but we're pursuing it anyway. That is the head wounds, which we discussed briefly. Could we begin by, at the risk of some repetition, telling us how you came into the room and what your position was in the room?
Relative to the president.
Yes. Well, did you talk with Dr. Clark?
We haven't talked to him yet. We've talked to most of the others. He's been, tied up.
Well, I have been at Parkland and at the UT Southwestern Medical School about, I guess, the beginning of July at the time, and Dr. Clark and I were sitting in the neurosurgery laboratory just talking in the morning, and in fact, we may have even been listening to the radio, about describing the motorcade, although I think we probably weren't. We probably were not. Of course, we would have heard some of the commotion or something. We were sitting there talking about the visit and so on. And then the phone rang, and someone, I guess, called us from the emergency room and said the president's been shot, come to the emergency room. And we looked at each other and said, this must be a bad joke. It's a sick joke or something. And then we looked at each other and said, well, maybe we better go over there. And so we walked to the elevator, took the elevator down, went across the parking lot. That parking lot's gone now. There's just some building there now, probably at that time. There's been so much growth and development of that school. And then when we were outside the entrance to the emergency room where the ambulances came up, we saw indeed something had happened. We saw all the cars there, and we started running, and we ran down into the emergency room. And at that time, he had already been brought into the emergency room, into trauma room 1. He already was in trauma room 1 at that point.
And you were a resident, excuse me?
No, I was on the faculty. I just joined the faculty. I was an instructor in neurosurgery.
In neurosurgery?
Yeah. Dr. Clark was the chief of the division of neurosurgery. And there were the two of us on the faculty at the time. And he was in the room and lying on, I don't know, a stretcher or a table. I don't remember which. And I can't remember all the attendings there. Dr. Clark has probably so much better memory for these things than I do. I'm pretty sure that Jim Carrico was there. I'm pretty sure that Malcolm Perry was there. And they had already done a tracheotomy on him by that point.
Would you say that you were perhaps the third or fourth there, fifth,
There were
sixth?
quite a few people in the room. I would have a hard time saying how many. But I would imagine there were 7 or 8 physicians there at least by that point. They were trying to get an EKG on him at that point. Or I guess maybe they had just put an EKG on him. They had already had blood running, I think, or at least IV fluids of some sort at that point, and they had a tracheotomy done at that point. But I don't think anybody had examined his head at that point, because I think he'd just been put on the stretcher. And as far as I know, I don't think at that moment anybody would really had an idea that there was a head wound at that point. Or if they did, I don't think they understood the magnitude of the head wound. Well, Dr. Clark, who was actually at that point, I think, the most senior person there, among the faculty in the room was the most senior person, then picked his head up, and we looked at his head.
You and Clark?
Dr. Clark.
Where were you standing when you actually came in?
Well, I could draw you a picture. And again, you'll probably find it, and you already know from your investigative work and all the things that they do in law schools to show how people are not reliable witnesses and so on. You probably will see many inconsistencies in people remembering as best they can. I'm sorry that I cannot remember the orientation of this room with respect to the corridor.
No, that's all right.
Well, no, but it's interesting. One ought to be able to remember that. And the president was lying this way, and Dr. Clark and I were over here, and I'm pretty sure like this. I have a feeling that perhaps some of the general surgeons were over here. I don't remember which ones were over here.
Okay, you're indicating that you were near the right
I'm pretty
head.
certain. I'm pretty certain we're on the right side.
At the head.
At the head of the table.
All right.
At that point, and Mrs. Kennedy was in the room too. She was in a corner. I don't remember which corner she was in. She may have been over here, possibly.
How did Dr. Clark lift up the head? From the right side? Or did he turn around and come from the back?
I can't remember that. I really can't remember that. All I remember is that he picked the head up. And then it was clear to me, that the right parietal bone had been lifted up by a bullet which had exited. That's the only thing that will do that the right parietal bone was elevated. It had the ear like this. Again, I couldn't be terribly... There are suture lines on the skull.
Actually, we can make that a little easier for you
We
in a
have
couple of ways. One, we have a model of a skull. And if you're willing to draw it on that, it would be very helpful to us. I have a pen here that will do the job fairly well.
Well, I can't be terribly specific about it, but I recall that there was a plate of bone lifted up somewhere about in this area. That it was hinged up. Whether it was hinged here or here, I don't know. But there was a plate of bone lifted up, and brain was visible underneath. You could see brain.
How would you characterize that region of the head? Is that occipital parietal, or?
That's, I can show you if you want to know. This is the frontal bone, okay? This is the parietal bone here, this entire thing here. You see the landmark of these sutures.
Right.
Would it be better if you could write on this?
All right, let's see it. Now the problem comes that a lot of people call anything back here the occipital area, okay? This is strictly speaking the occipital bone, but frankly, this little bump here is called the parietal boss, also sometimes called King's Point. And what happens is that people tend to sort of call anything back here the occipital area, even though it's not strictly speaking the occipital bone.
Roughly the back fourth or fifth of the head.
Back
you're saying.
fifth of the head, they tend to call that.
Well then, okay. Will you draw the wound as you've drawn it here? Could you transfer it to the flat paper?
Probably about like this. And probably sort of like this.
More parietal than occipital.
In terms of the
Well,
bones,
as far as the exit, okay? But there was an entrance wound also. This was an exit wound. There was an entrance wound here also. The entrance wound was in the occipital bone.
Did you see that yourself?
Yeah, I saw that myself. I'm pretty certain of that. Again, these things are so dramatic, but I'm pretty certain that there was an entrance wound here because I was pretty certain I saw a cerebellum back over here.
But was that a gaping wound?
It was a fairly big wound. Yeah.
Not just like a bullet hole size.
No, it was a fairly big wound.
You've drawn it almost as big as this wound here.
Well, my impression was if I can tell you my impression, I could be wrong.
Sure.
My impression was that there was an entrance wound over here.
Could you illustrate it on the model as well?
Back here. I couldn't say whether it was on this side or the midline, It might have been in the midline.
What made you say that was an entrance and this was an exit?
Well, because the only thing this could be would be an exit wound, because the bone was lifted up like a flap. Something had clearly come from inside and pushed it out. And the only place that could have come from was this hole over here.
Did this the big hole in the back? Did that have a what were the characteristics of that wound? Were the edges fairly defined, or were they scored out, or what?
I couldn't say exactly, really. All I could say is that there was a hole punch in it. You could see brains there also.
It didn't have any characteristics of an exit wound? As far as you can recall?
No, it didn't really. It looked like a hole.
Well, which of the two gaping wounds that you described was bigger?
This one.
The parietal.
Yeah. And that's characteristic. That's characteristic of exit wounds. Of course, they're always bigger than entrance wounds.
But you do remember seeing a large wound in the rear of the head too.
Yeah.
What, were you seeing brain tissues through here
Yeah.
as well as through here?
Yeah.
Was brain tissue actually coming out of the wounds in either place? Do you recall?
Yeah, it's hard to say coming out, but I mean, yeah, it wasn't exactly within the confines of the skull. It wasn't flowing all over, but there was some brain tissue.
So you had obviously a good opportunity to see the rear of the head.
Well, I don't
From your side on the vantage, you were on the right side. You
Yeah.
must at some point walked around and seen the back.
Well, as I recall, we picked his head up this way. As I recall, we picked it up and looked at it this way.
You were both doing this simultaneously.
Well, I think Dr. Clark was holding it.
But you could see it
Yeah,
at the same time.
I could see.
There isn't a possibility, is there, that the whole right side of his head was blown off, and that this was one big wound, those two that you described?
No, I don't think
Two
so.
separate wounds.
I'm pretty certain there were two separate wounds there.
All right.
Can I borrow that just for a second?
Sure.
What I'd like to do is darken in the line you've drawn.
Sure.
I want to show you now a photograph, actually a tracing of a photograph, which purports to be accurate to the hair, of a photo taken at the autopsy. This is published on page 104 of Volume 7 of the House Assassinations Committee report. The rear of the president's head, the ruler, the hands, etc. How does that photograph square with your recollection of what you saw?
I don't know, this might be this parietal, this might be this bone flap lifted up over here.
You're referring to the upper right parietal.
Yeah, that might be that flap of bone there, that lifted up there. And this might be the entrance, or this might be the entrance wound. I don't know.
Is that consistent with what you remember, or does it seem inconsistent in any way?
No, it seems consistent. It seems consistent.
I don't see
But where would the big hole in the bottom of the head be?
Well, I don't know. I may have drawn it bigger than it was, but my impression was there was a hole somewhere in the back, and my impression was I could see some brain back in there. So, I don't know whether it was here or here, frankly, but there was a hole somewhere in the back. I was pretty certain of that. And I thought I could see some brain in the back. But I don't think this is really inconsistent. My impression of this hole back here was that it was somewhat bigger than they have it here.
Well, there are two. You see a wound in the cowlick area here, and the official explanation now from this House committee is that that's the entrance wound, and this is the exit wound. The autopsist said that this was the entrance wound. The officials have rejected that explanation and are calling this simply brain tissue, this thing on the hairline.
It's a bit of evolved brain tissue that was loose.
There remains
That
some
it fell down there.
Yes, basically.
there remains some controversy about that.
I bet Dr. Clark has a much better idea of it than I have, because he was the person lifting the head up, and
Did anyone shine a light, do you recall, inside the wounds or examine them?
no. My reaction was, that we saw many bullet wounds in Parkland Hospital, because of the amount of violence there is absolutely tremendous. but I had never seen a wound like that before, particularly the exit wound, because we never saw anybody shot with a high-velocity rifle before. I mean, people mostly got shot with bullets from, pistols, which were low velocity, so that we had never really seen anything quite like that before. And on one look at it, I mean, it was clear to us this is not a survivable situation. So I don't think that we spent a great deal of time looking at it. I mean, I think it was more or less clear when we looked at it that this was not survivable, and we didn't probe it or spend a lot of time looking at it.
So getting back to page 104 just for a second. Yeah, this rear autopsy photo. Although you have described a larger hole in the occipital area, we don't see that there. Can you resolve that a little bit for us?
Well, I could have been wrong. It was a very dramatic thing, to say the least. And it was extremely dramatic. And my impression of how large this hole back here was could be incorrect. But I do recall a hole there, and I do recall seeing brain tissue back there. I don't think it's really inconsistent.
Let me show you another photograph now, another drawing.
Yeah.
You recall Dr. McClellan?
Yeah.
He testified to the Warren Commission that he was in such a position that, I'm quoting, I could very closely examine the head wound, and I noted that the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. He goes on to describe that in some detail. And this is a drawing prepared based on that description by someone who published a book. I want to stress that McClellan did not prepare this sketch, but it was based on his description that this sketch was prepared. What are your comments about that in view of what you saw?
Well, I think this is too low. I think there is a big plate of bone lifted up, but my impression was the plate was more up over here, and I think that's too low.
So you would see that as a wound of exit, but it would correspond to this one, except it's in the wrong place.
It's in the wrong place. It's too low.
What about the large wound in that area that you drew on the skull? Would that be too large for that?
That's too large. That's too large for that.
About the right place for it?
I don't know. I think what this person was drawing here was this, but he just put it too low.
All right. This is a drawing from someone who sketched the autopsy photographs. This is another view of an autopsy photograph from the right profile, showing a gaping wound here in the right, I guess, temporal parietal area. That's even more forward. What are your thoughts about that one?
I think that's pretty reasonable compared to what I saw here. You have to remember that I think what we were looking at here is quite consistent with this, because I said there was a plate that had been elevated. So we saw a part of it that was sort of sticking up, but obviously it must have been broken, somewhere deeper to be elevated like that. And I think that's quite consistent. It's basically in the same area. And they have the advantage of looking at all the fracture lines, whereas, all I could see was the part that was sort of sticking up where the skin had been ripped.
This illustration seems to put the entry hole higher on the head than you did.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't, that does not disturb me. I mean, take care of lots of people with bullet wounds. I think what I've seen here is quite consistent with the exit. The entrance, I can just say, was, I looked at it for perhaps, I don't think we had the head up for more than 15 seconds, perhaps. I mean, I don't think it took us much longer than that to see that we're dealing with a fatal wound, and that there were a lot of other things to do, like regarding his heart and to try to see if there's any viability there. So my impression was there was an entrance somewhere back here, and the brain was visible. And in fact, it's quite possible in life this may have been more gaping and more dramatic. They've made it higher than where I remember it, but, they could be wrong or I could be wrong.
Do you recall what kind of tissue, were you able to distinguish what kind of tissue you were seeing through what appeared to be the wound of entry?
No, I could just say there was brain
Very
tissue.
difficult, well, as to whether it was cerebral or cerebellum, whatever. you
No.
couldn't tell.
No, I couldn't. Yeah, I couldn't say.
You did not testify before the Warren Commission, right?
No.
And you don't know why that is? They simply didn't call you.
No, they simply didn't. They simply didn't call me. I think, there's probably nothing I would have said that Dr. Clark, who's by far more experienced, more senior than me, could have said.
It's the first you've ever been interviewed about the case?
Yes, yes. It is.
No, other than to, if we could just get your correct present title and position, Dr. Grossman, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, it's Robert G. Grossman, and Professor and Chairman, Department of Neurosurgery, Baylor College of Medicine. Dramatically. As I said, we just did not see that type of bullet wound at Parkland, although we saw a tremendous number of bullet wounds. We just never saw anything like that because we just didn't see people shot with high-velocity rifles. And that was, clearly, in magnitude. It was clearly an exit wound, but the actual magnitude of the plate of bone being lifted up was just something that you just didn't see with ordinary pistol bullet wounds.
Were the margins of that wound, the large wound of the upper portion of the skull, were they fairly distinct, or were they obscured?
I really couldn't say. All I could say is that there was a large plate of bone lifted up.
Which had to have been an exit wound by
Yes,
definition,
yes,
as far as you're concerned.
Yeah, it has to be.
Did his hair make it at all difficult to tell what you're looking at?
No, it didn't. He had quite a thatch of hair, sort of like a cowlick sticking up patch of hair, which was, all around here, but it wasn't conscious. Well, have you talked with Dr. Perry?
He's in New York. We haven't got to him. We're sort of on the
talked to him on the
Texas
phone.
swing.
We haven't gotten a chance to visit him yet, so.
Right, and Dr. Carrico?
He's in Seattle.
Seattle. Are you going to go all around?
No, we don't know.
Everybody?
It depends. As
We
we're
figured we
developing
could get a group
consensus
here first and get a preliminary idea whether it seemed to be worth pursuing at that point, and then decide whether to make some of these other trips that are possible.
Right.
Do you think this could be a case of legitimate confusion as to the placement of this wound, or some people putting it further back than others?
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
I think it easily. I think you're very wise to have actual sculpture drawn, because there is this ambiguity about what constitutes the occipital and parietal area, because it is a very large area, and people will say, oh, that's occipital from all the way over here, when it's really the posterior parietal bone, unless they're going to refer to the bone precisely. In fact, many doctors don't even know where the parietal bone ends. They're very good doctors in the stomach or heart or some other area. So that's quite legitimate in terms of confusion.
But would even you as a neurosurgeon perhaps would be much more precise about this than some of the other doctors who are hovering around the table.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
As I darkened in those lines, Dr. Grossman, they still do represent the lines that you drew, is that right?
Right. And as I said, back here, this is very difficult to be certain. Back here. In fact, when I look at it, I could say I must have made an error here, even in this drawing. I tell you what, because the neck muscles attach over here, you see, to this line, and the entrance that I've drawn would have to have been higher, because you could not see down here. All you would see is thick neck muscles. So where I've drawn this probably should be somewhat higher. Okay?
Still that size.
My impression was it was about that size, yeah.
Now, is that consistent with an entry wound, something that size?
Yeah, I think so. You have to remember, if you're looking at it here, the flaps of skin probably have been pushed back. There's been maybe some swelling. There's been some dried blood and so on. But at the time, I had an impression it was a fairly big something here, and I could see some brain under here.
You've drawn that near the occipital protuberance?
Yeah. This is the occipital protuberance right here.
A little bit above it.
So it's above it, yeah. I think if you can get to see Dr. Clark, he probably would be, I think, probably more accurate than me on this. Is he, was more. There are an incredible number of people. I mean, you wouldn't believe the mail letters that that he got.
Clark.
Yes.
What sort of
people.
letters saying? You let him die, you mean?
Just all sorts of crazy letters. Not particularly accusing, but just this huge volume of, almost irrational jumble of comments. I mean, they're sort of like the letters you get to your editorial page.
But are still
Most of which are totally unintelligible, even when they're cleaned up and printed. And, frankly, for that reason, most of us were just trying to do our work. We don't honestly care even have our names in the paper and to be exposed to more lunatics, of whom there are plenty around just looking for targets to pick on or shoot at. And, I think that, these stories do tend to excite the lunatic fringe. Most of us are busy enough trying to take care of our patients and our work without getting more involved with the lunatic fringe.
Okay. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not.
I don't have any more questions, sir.